And so what's interesting is that I got an email this morning from or that I did for my normal video newsletter, and this guy wrote in, and this girl he's been dating like 3 months. It's like some girl that came back in the picture that he dated when he was in his early 20s, I guess, and he screwed up with her. And so he's been dating her for like the last 3 or 4 months, and he says they're both leftists. But she's like really left, meaning she's like speech police and is like very militant about the pronoun thing and using those. And uh, and so they, even though they're both leftists, self-avowed leftists, it's like they really butt heads on things because he doesn't agree with her and that stuff. So, they're kind of a little arguing a little bit. And so what I was kind of talking about is the communism, socialism, Marxism, collectivism, the political philosophy that is very idealistic. That's a lot of people in academia support it, and it's the collectivist versus the individualist ideology. Obviously, the United States was built upon. If you look at the second line of the Declaration of Independence, it spells out that there's a creator. It's assumed there's a creator. It doesn't matter whether you believe in God or not, but it's assumed there is a creator, and therefore all American citizens are, in essence, born onto this earth because it's the Lord's will. And therefore we have certain unalienable rights, which unalienable means it can't be separated from you. And that's the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In other words, you own your body. You're an individual. You're here because the Creator put you here. And therefore, the Constitution is written from the perspective of protecting the sovereignty of the individual, protecting the rights of the minority from the tyranny of the majority. And so because we've been talking a lot about the Ukraine war, especially over the weekend and stuff, and you look at like the Russian weapons and how they're faring against the Western type of weapons, and we look at just like I was talking about in this video newsletter, the tank design. And so what the socialist ideal is, hey, this is the good of everybody. We're going to live in a paradise. We're not going to have any evil rich people. You'll work when you need to work to make some money. You will all work and do things we love. If you want to be a farmer or if you want to do art, you'll be able to just basically do whatever you want and there'll be enough for everybody. And it sounds wonderful. That it sounds like a great utopia, and it's just the evil rich people or certain groups of people or others are the ones that get in the way of that collectivist paradise. And so the problem with collectivist ideology is that people get treated like drones, disposable drones of the state, if you will. I mean, you look at China, when China has somebody that's committed a crime or they're going to be put to death or whatever, they don't just execute them. I've even read stories of the Chinese doctors have developed like this bladder that they can basically put in a person's, I guess, aorta or whatever, to their brains to restrict the blood flow. So in essence, kills the brain, but you're able to keep the body alive. And then what you're able to do is you're able to preserve more organs that way for organ donation. And so because the state basically runs and owns everything, the collectivist ideology, the good of the community, if you will, like part of the ideals of the Xi Jinping, the Chinese Communist Party, is family. In other words, we're all part of a big family as long as you comply with our mandates and our dictates. And if you don't, well, we don't just execute you when you do something wrong. Your organs get harvested and then you die. And so you look at in the United States specifically, when you look at how in other words, every individual is supposed to be precious in the United States, whereas under communism, socialism, Marxism, the problem is every time it's been tried to be implemented, and communism, Marxism, socialism, collectivism, whatever you want to call it, has been tried in over 100 countries on 6 different continents over the last 150 years, whatever it happens to be. And so there's a body count of about 150 million people. And because people become drones of the state, in other words, the state owns you and owns your body in essence because it's for the good of everybody. But under our system, the individual is precious, and the Constitution is written to restrain the government so it doesn't infringe upon our rights. It's not there to tell us what our rights are. Our rights are assumed to come from the Creator, and therefore they're spelled out. And that's the Bill of Rights, all that stuff comes from that idea. And so each life is precious in the West. But under collectivism, and what happens when you actually try to implement communism and you destroy the state, you destroy the system, you defund the police, what ends up happening over time is slowly all power gets concentrated in the central government, which ultimately, just because of the way communism, socialism, Marxism works, what you end up with is only the most vicious, ruthless, psychopathic, backstabbing, mass murdering, genocidal people rise to the top of that system. And anybody that gets in their way, they get whacked.
Yeah, the secret police comes after them.
Yep.
They just like all the citizens are just resources to the whole government.
Yeah, exactly. One of the first things they always do is they disarm everybody. Even Mao said that the power of the Chinese Communist Party comes from the barrel of a gun. And so when you have these dunces here in the West that have believed what they've been told on TV, because weakness always invites aggression, but when, one of the reasons why the Founding Fathers put the Second Amendment in the Constitution is because the whole body of the American people are supposed to be ready, willing, and able. They're supposed to be armed. They're supposed to be ready if they get called up for state militia duty. And their words were, who are the militia? The militia are, in fact, the people themselves and include all men capable of bearing arms. And because there's a lot of arguing about Second Amendment, is it an individual right, is it not? Everybody's supposed to be armed. Everybody's supposed to have pistol, rifle. I mean, back in the days of the Founding Fathers, they had cannons, they had pistols, they had rifles, they had what was called a puckle gun, which was the first machine gun, but they were expensive and they were expensive to make, kind of, they're heavy, not the most easy thing to use, and so they didn't really use them very much, but they had machine gun technology because a lot of people on the left that don't know history and don't know anything about the Second Amendment like to say, well, these kinds of weapons, the AR-15, the Founding Fathers never envisioned. Like, no, the citizens had military-grade weapons because when they got called up for militia duty, they brought their cannons, they brought their pistols, their rifles, their muskets, their puckle machine guns. And I think there was one other type of machine gun that existed at the time. I can't remember the name of it, but there were two different types of machine guns that were in existence during the time of the Revolutionary War, and most people just don't know that. And when you look at the writings, I think it was Patrick Henry Lee, if I'm not mistaken, he was the one that said, who are the militia? The militia are, in fact, the people themselves and include all men capable of bearing arms. He was one of the signers of the original Constitution. He was one of the guys that helped form what is our Constitution today. He was a very important founding father. And there were dozens of them that all had the same opinion that's in their writings. It was very obvious. They wanted the people at large to be properly armed because when people were disarmed, they were subject to a government that becomes tyrannical. And that's just a fact of life. That's the actual history. It doesn't matter whether you agree with it or you like it or not. In the West, it's an individual right. The Bruin decision that just came down from the Supreme Court just once again validated that it's an individual right, but the people on the left, they don't care. So their attitude is, like if you look at what happened in New York after the Bruin decision, what they basically said was you basically had to justify why the state should allow you to carry a firearm in New York. And that got declared unconstitutional. So what did New York do? The leftist legislature turned right around, passed another law, which is obviously a constitutional infringement, but they know that they're going to tie the gun lobby and patriots up in court for 8 or 10 years before that's going to potentially get overturned. So in the meantime, the state is going to infringe on people's rights because, again, people that lean left have a collectivist Marxist type of ideology where they believe in the supremacy of the state. We're going to keep you safe. You don't need guns. Nobody needs a 30-round magazine, Corey. They're going to protect everyone. Only the police and the government, even though people on the left are like, we got to defund the police. Well, you're not going to, if you want to disarm the people, it's not like the whole society is going to be completely disarmed. It's just people in government specify can have guns will be allowed to have them.
They have a monopoly on force.
Yes, they have a monopoly on force. And so, one of the first things that Hitler did when he took power is he said that unless you work for the government, the police, the military, you don't need a gun. And so you should just give those up. And so it's one of the first, I think the first thing he did was he registered them, and then he says, hey, you got to turn these in unless you're in the army, the military, or whatever. This is a civilized society. You don't need guns anyways. They're going to keep us safe. Just, look at Australia. Look what they did. Look what they did in New Zealand. It's like, doesn't matter whether you like it or you agree with it or not. It's assumed there's a creator. The creator gave us unalienable rights, and that includes guns. It's already been settled by the Supreme Court, but obviously people on the left are just, most of them are not going to accept that. But the one thing I like about JFK is he's supportive of it. So back to talking about collectivist ideology and how that affects weapons and what's going on in the Ukrainian war. So obviously we've been at war for over 20 years in the United States when you look at Iraq and Afghanistan. And so we had a lot of problems with IEDs. We had the explosively formed penetrators, those, the weapons that the Iranians were using. And it's like a metal cylinder, and it has like an inverted copper cone and then an explosive behind it. And so when those IEDs would go off, it would explode and it would turn the inverted little copper cone that's like welded it or pressed into the front. And so what that does, it turns it into molten metal and it shoots it at a small piece in the armor. And because it's so hot and it's traveling at a high velocity, it goes right through the door of a Humvee or some of our tanks and some of our less armored vehicles like butter. And obviously, if you're on the other side of that door and that thing goes right through, it's going right through you as well. And those were most of the injuries that our troops suffered in Iraq was from IEDs and those EFPs, which, the Iranians had done. And so we spent a lot of money and a lot of resources with our Bradley fighting vehicles, our M1A1 tanks, our Humvees, Strikers, and all these different vehicles that our troops use to protect them from armor penetrating type of weapons, because every life is precious. Every individual is precious. And so you take the M1A1 Abrams tank, which was developed in the late 70s, early 80s. I was a kid growing up watching these things get developed. And it was really an incredible advancement. What they did is, so if you can watch video of this, it's on YouTube, of guys firing shells on the inside of the tank. And so behind the gunner is there's a blast-proof door that the gunner opens. It slides open. He pulls out the round that he needs, and then the door closes, and then he puts it in the loader and then the barrel and then shoots the round. And so if the tank gets hit with some kind of armor penetrating round or whatever, and the ammunition gets set off, there are like doors on the top of the ammunition compartment that explode upwards. And so the force of the blast is supposed to be directed upwards outside of the tank. So the compartment where the guy, the three guys, I think it's three people in the M1. I think you got the gunner, you got the commander, you got the driver. I'm sure you guys can correct me in the comments. I think it's three dudes that drive the M1 tank. M1A1 Abrams tank. And so it's got the most advanced armor in the world, the Chobham armor, which is like it's like ceramic, and then I think it has like depleted uranium in it, which is an incredibly dense metal, and it's the best protective armor that so far that I have anybody I've seen. It's the best armor that humans have come up with. And so everything is designed to protect the individuals in that tank. And so if your tank hits an IED or it gets hit with some kind of armor piercing projectile, then say the ammunition detonates, most of the time your crew is going to survive, and then you just take your crew as long as they're not severely injured or they don't have a TBI, traumatic brain injury. You just give them a new tank and they're back in the fight the next day. Whereas when you look, and so that's every individual is precious in the West, or at least in America. But under collectivist, the communist system, when you look at all of the Russian tanks, is that they have what's called an autoloader. And so you have the gunner and he's basically sitting on top of all the ammunition, all the shells and all the powder charges that send the projectile out the barrel. And since it's collectivist, the individual doesn't really matter. You're part of the drones of the state. You're a disposable, usable
You're the little worker
commodity.
ant.
If you look at like during World War II, when because the Russians didn't have enough rifles to give everybody a gun, and so the people that they didn't have a guns for, they would give them a wooden broomstick and they would paint it black. And so when they would charge the German lines, the only way you got a rifle if you were one of the dudes holding the broomstick was if somebody that had a rifle got killed, that you would pick up their rifle and their ammunition, and now you would have a weapon. And so they would just do waves, like meat assaults of people that just basically. So you got a bunch of people charging a position. Some of them have rifles, some of them do not. And instead of all, you would think normal people would go, well, let's just send the guys with guns. It's kind of stupid to go run at something if you don't have any kind of weapons. So they say, hey, we'll paint broomsticks black and it'll look like they have rifles. So they basically can absorb bullets because you can only shoot so many people. And the idea was to overwhelm the lines with troops. The Chinese did this during the Korean War. They just did same thing with the Vietnamese. They just did massive charges of people because it's for the good of the collective. It's going to protect all of us. So they were willing to sacrifice people and just basically turn them into bullet magnets. And so that same kind of collectivist ideology, there wasn't much thought put in to really try to preserve and save the tank crews. And so when the Russian tanks get penetrated by an armor-piercing round or some kind of incendiary, sometimes the Russians you can see plenty of videos of this stuff, where you got a drone flying overhead and they drop a grenade down inside. And when the grenade goes off, it's going to set off the ammunition. And so if all three of the guys are driving the Russian tank are sitting there, it detonates the ammunition, you're going to take out the tank and you're going to kill the whole crew. And whereas in the West, the protecting the sovereignty and the precious life of the individual, there's a really good chance that those individuals in the M1A1 Abrams tank are going to survive, and you just give them a new tank. Same thing with the Bradley fighting vehicle. When you look at some of the other, troop carriers and armored type of vehicles that the Russians use, there was a very famous. Say famous now, but a couple weeks ago when the counteroffensive started, there was a group of troops. There was like 4 or 5 mine clearing vehicles that all got taken out by mines, and then they lost like 4 or 5 Bradley vehicles. They all hit mines as well. I think they lost like 2 Leopard tanks, and which was a lot of very expensive Western gear that just got wiped out. But the majority of the crews survived just because it was designed to be survived. Whereas again, when the Russian APCs are hit or their tanks are hit, it's most of the time you're losing everybody that's in that vehicle. And so, all the training, all the money that's invested in getting those guys to be competent at running their weapons systems doesn't matter because now they're dead. And so what happened with the counteroffensive when it started a couple weeks ago, when they lost all those Bradleys and a couple Leopard tanks, all in the same area. You can see the pictures and the video of it, and the Russians keep using it over and over. They don't have any other video of any other types of events where a bunch of Western equipment or heavy losses are. Because if they did, they would be using it as part of their propaganda. And so our Western vehicles fare very good compared to the Russian, because this is just a war of attrition. You're taking out their equipment, their weapons, their vehicles, and killing as many of their troops. And hopefully, more of the Ukrainians are surviving just because they're better vehicles. It's really designed around saving the lives of the individual.
And you also see that on the level too, not just on the tanks. You actually see that in the weapons as well, in the calibers. Like the Russians are famous for using the 7.62 round because it just has more lethality. But the Westerns
it's a bigger
and NATOs
bullet and has heavier mass.
Use the 5.56 because it's more likely to just cause injuries and not complete death. And that's one of the big in the 2 weapon systems. That's when they were being designed. Back in the day, they wanted it to where they injured the people because it took out more. Not only did you could say they didn't want to kill people, but if just injuring people used way
They
more
want to
resources.
wound them, tie up the medics,
Yeah,
tie up.
tie them up.
Because if they're dead, you zip them up and you put them on a body bag and throw them in the back and you move on. But if somebody lives, then you need usually three, four people to carry them, and so that ties up all the people trying to help them.
And then the
I
resources,
saw I saw
medicine.
a drone video yesterday. It's just horrible to see all the death and destruction on both sides. But there was a Ukrainian medic, and he had a Bradley parked, and the back of the ramp goes down on the Bradley, and so about 15, 20 feet away, there's 4 or 5 Ukrainians because there's a wounded Ukrainian soldier, and so this medic's trying to go to get to them, and so he jumps off the back of the door in the back of the Bradley, and he jumps in a bomb crater. He's thinking can't be no mines in that, and he lands, and soon he like kind of lands on his legs, or he falls down. He lands on his leg, and he lands right on top of a fucking mine. And there was a drone right above this guy that was filming the whole thing. The mine goes off, and his right leg just turns into spaghetti and flesh. And so first thing he does is apply a tourniquet so he doesn't bleed out. And then he crawls back into the Bradley with his what's left of his mangled leg and foot, and just a blood trail. It's just horrible. This is going on right now, and so it's awful. Just the I've seen so many videos of so many people blown up, shot. I've seen Ukrainian special forces charging. They're getting behind the Russian lines and then going down in their trenches and shooting the Russians. And these guys, they didn't know what was coming. They didn't expect people in their rear lines, and they're just mowing these dudes down. And so you're losing hundreds of thousands of men in Russian men, and hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian men, and being wounded, mangled for life, or killed in action. And that's a tremendous amount of brain drain in future generations that you're losing. And things keep going the way they're going. It's so interesting, like what happened with the guy that runs Wagner over the weekend, which is the equivalent would be like Blackwater here in the United States, which is a private military contract. I think most people have heard of Blackwater. And so that's kind of like what Wagner is for Russia, who the guy is the chef, and he's an oligarch basically, and he's probably a billionaire. And so you basically have a bunch of mafia type of elite that are running Russia, which used to be a communist nation, but that collectivist ideology and the fact that they're doing, Wagner got, I don't know, it was like probably 6 months. What the Russians were doing is going to people in jail saying, hey, if you go fight in the front lines and you survive for 6 months, you can be a murderer. Doesn't matter how horrible crimes you committed. If you survive for 6 months, your sentence will be considered served, and you can just go back and have a normal life, if you will. And so in Bakhmut, the Wagner guys were using just assaults of these prisoners as like cannon fodder. Basically, they didn't really get much training. And what they did is they would charge the Ukrainian lines, and then the Russians could sit in the rear and figure out, once the Ukrainians were firing on these Wagner guys, they could figure out where the Ukrainians were so they could shoot artillery at them, or be able to attack them without really risking themselves. And it's just thousands and thousands of dudes just got absolutely mowed down left and right as cannon fodder. Because again, it's the collectivist mindset. The individual doesn't matter. It's not precious. And one of the interesting things that Lao Tzu said, he says, when armies are evenly matched, the one with compassion wins. And so if you look at the Ukrainian people and the ones that are fighting, and they're fighting for their survival and their freedom, and you got the Russians who, I also saw a video last week of, and the Russians did this in World War II. You're not allowed to leave your lines. If your lines gets overrun, you're expected to stay there and keep shooting the enemy until you get killed. And so there was about 8 or 10 Russians, and there was a drone that filmed all this, and you can see them. They're running back towards the second line of defense, because they had all ran away because they got hit with really accurate artillery fire, and they were just getting slaughtered. There was only 8 or 10 of them left from that area that they fled from. And so they're running the lines behind them, and they got their hands up. And some of the guys didn't even have any weapons. And the Russians come out from their lines with their guns, and they just mowed these dudes down. Shot, they got their hands up. They're like, hey, and the dude's shooting them point blank range, like where Chunky is. Dude falls on the ground, and they keep shooting them, and they just murdered these guys because they fled, because they're not allowed to do that. And again, this is more collectivist mindset, collectivist ideology, and where it ultimately ends up